Hi, class. The United States of America is going to war. And why? Most Americans were isolationists until what major event occurred in U.S. history we talked about in the last lecture? The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This changes everything. The Japanese strike force killed 2,403 U.S. personnel, including 68 civilians. The Japanese only lost about 100 men. The attack destroyed or damaged 19 U.S. Navy ships, including 8 battleships. Those are hard to come by, too. Class, the USS Arizona is still there in the water and marks the resting place of over 1,000 of these soldiers and Marines killed. You can visit the memorial today if you go to Hawaii. Thankfully, the 3 aircraft carriers of the United States Pacific Fleet were out to sea on maneuvers. The Japanese were unable to locate them and were forced to return home with the U.S. carrier fleet intact. This is going to be a big turning point for us. According to a Gallup poll taken after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 97% of Americans approved of declaring war. What a shift in public opinion. If you'll recall, I said last time, only one person voted against going to war, and it was Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to serve in the House of Representatives. She said, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." But now, America will be united against a common enemy. But what's going to happen next? Who will help us fight the Japanese? Britain's almost bankrupt from fighting Germany. France and the French resistance was hanging on by a thread. And the Soviet Union is still reeling from that sneak attack by Germany, remember? We understand we will need to figure out how to win a war fought on 2 fronts, class, and numerous places throughout the world. We make an agreement to help the allies of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and they'll help us along with places like Canada and Australia. The main troops will be fighting in Europe proper against Germany and Italy. We know we're going to need to help them defeat Hitler, but we also need to place focus in the Pacific campaign against Japan. And on this slide is a propaganda poster declaring Americans will not be fooled by Hitler and his wartime propaganda. He's attacking democracy. The soldier on the slide is my father, who fought in the Aleutian Island campaign in Alaska. This was one of the few American territories where Japanese actually invaded. But the Japanese attack in the Aleutians and other places in the world will eventually be put down by those brave soldiers like my father and those who fought beside him. And I bet you have a World War II soldier in your family. Find out their story and let me know. So just hours after attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacks American airfields at Manila in the Philippines. Remember when we occupied the Philippines? Then American territories at Guam, Wake Island, the British colony of Hong Kong, Singapore. So that one by one, these areas in the Pacific were either destroyed or attacked or surrendered to the Japanese, and we knew we had to act quickly. The first important victory, class, for America and the Allied forces against Japan will be in May of 1942, when the Allied forces turned back the previously unstoppable Japanese fleet in the Battle of Coral Sea. Then we fought the Battle of Midway Island. Now, Midway is a small, tiny American outpost, but its importance was that it was strategically placed smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Though many battles were fought and lives lost, the Americans won the central part of the Pacific back for the Allies. We would take the offense for the first time in Guadalcanal, and in August of 1942, American forces assaulted several islands over a period of 6 months. Again, tragically, heavy losses occurred on both sides. But the Japanese are now forced to leave the southern Pacific area and would be on the defense from this point forward. On the European front, there are several differences in opinion as to how the Allies should progress. Great Britain had ideas. The Soviet Union was trying to fight off Germans in their country, and a small part of the Free French forces were aiding the Allies as well with their own agendas. And the U.S. comes in with our ideas. Much of Europe is under brutal attack from the Axis forces. So Britain was trying to get the Americans to help them first, while the Soviets wanted the Americans to help them, as well as the French. So the European front is complicated, class, and we don't really have time to cover it here. But in general terms, again, the big issues for the Soviets is the German invasion. There's very high casualty loss on both sides there, a lot of bloody hand-to-hand combat. Not only did a lot of Soviets lose their lives, and these were civilians and soldiers, many were displaced or wounded. And again, the Germans thought they'd only be there a short time. They weren't really prepared for winter battles. Many Germans ended up dying of starvation and freezing temperatures. The Soviets will always be angry with the Allies for not coming to their aid during the German invasion. That's something to think about. The Soviets will lose more lives in World War II than all of the other Allies, and this also happened in World War I. But eventually, the Allies come up with a plan to win the European front. First up, they're going to attack Sicily, and within days had conquered the island, heading toward the Italian mainland. Let's take down Mussolini. Mussolini's government will eventually collapse, and Mussolini's successor will commit Italy to the Allies. So they switch sides during World War II. Mussolini's story is an interesting one if you get a chance to read about his demise. I'll tell you this much: Italians hated him and his castor oil treatments, and when he and his mistress were on the run in 1945, he was captured, Italians killed him, and hung him upside down in a local gas station for all to see. The British forces will drive the Germans from North Africa. Really, battles are being fought all over the world, class, and I've pulled in a couple of documentaries for you to watch if you want to know more. But one thing I do want to talk a few minutes about is the Holocaust. And during World War II, the Nazi campaign of the final solution to exterminate the Jews from Europe was in full swing. This had been years in the making by Hitler. Washington knew some of what was going on, but for whatever reason, we did little to find a way to help. And I should point out that a number of Jews fled to the United States and pleaded with our government to understand the scope of what was going on at the hands of Hitler, to no avail. And they did that in Britain as well. An example of our misdoing is a German passenger ship named St. Louis arriving in Miami in 1939, carrying nearly 1,000 escaped German Jews. Class, we turned them away and forced them back to Europe, where most historians agree that the majority died. We also chose not to bomb the crematoriums or the rail lines carrying Jews into the extermination or labor camps. Really, the horror of the Holocaust was in the systematic torturing and killing of people. It was a genocide. 6 million Jews and 4 million others will lose their lives. The others included gypsies, homosexuals, people with special needs, political and religious enemies of Hitler. This was definitely one of the saddest chapters of the war, and if you want to know more about the Holocaust, let me suggest Night Will Fall, a documentary directed by the one and only Alfred Hitchcock, or read the book Night by Elie Wiesel, who lived through it. Back in America, World War II, this wartime boom, is going to aid in finally ending our Great Depression. The West, and particularly California, is going to receive a great deal of money from the government in way of wartime contracts, government-funded capital investments, businesses, buildings, aircraft, shipbuilding. The South will end up with many military bases and the training of soldiers. Everyone in America will be affected by the war, in particular, women. Men are enlisting and being drafted and leaving for war, and this is going to leave the older population, younger men not quite old enough for the military, and previously unemployed minorities and women to fill the gaps in employment in America. But what about women? Women took jobs, many for the first time, outside the home. And while advances had been made, many jobs still were categorized by gender and race. Often this meant more menial tasks and very low wages for women and minorities, but now women are hired to work in factory jobs, munitions work, and industrial type jobs that they've never held before. Of course, they still make less than the men who were paid to do the same exact job. In some jobs, companies appeal to women by comparing it to something they already knew. Recruiters told women that cutting airplane wings was like making a dress pattern, or mixing chemicals was like making a cake. At any rate, women began to work in large numbers. Women were also joining the military in larger numbers than ever before. Class, Rosie the Riveter is a cultural icon of World War II, representing women who worked in these factories and shipyards and joined unions during World War II. It's also the name of a song written during the time. If you ever heard a song you cannot get out of your mind, go to YouTube and listen to Rosie the Riveter and you'll see what I mean. After the war, many of the women will simply be fired, but all in all, employment for women outside of the home increases and continues to rise after World War II. Since there's more jobs available during World War II, Mexicans come across the border in large numbers to fill empty positions. Now listen to this. Both governments, U.S. and Mexico, agreed on a limited work permit for specific jobs. And American businesses advertised for and recruited Mexican workers. Before the Depression, most Mexican Americans worked in agriculture. And they did during the war too, but they also began to work in factories and munition plants and such. Over 300,000 served in the U.S. military as well. Class, the Bracero Program was a series of laws and diplomatic agreements initiated in 1942 when the United States signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement with Mexico. The agreement guaranteed some decent living conditions, adequate shelter and food, and a minimum wage of 30 cents an hour to be paid to workers from Mexico. This plan will stay in place until 1954, when we put into place and utilize special tactics to deal with illegal border crossings into the United States by Mexican nationals. Class, Operation Wetback, yes, I said it, Operation Wetback, is going to try to control the pressures and the effects of Mexican immigrants continuing to come into the United States without legal permission. Upon implementation, Operation Wetback gave rise to widespread arrest and deportation by the United States Border Control. Does any of this sound familiar? It turned into somewhat of a fiasco after we began deporting profiled individuals who were actually American citizens. But those Mexican Americans who did move to the United States during this time came in large numbers and began to work and settled, in particular in California. In Los Angeles, there were actually Mexican American street gangs who wore these things called zoot suits. They were long, loose jackets with padded shoulders and baggy pants tied at the ankles. And they wore chains and broad-rimmed hats. And I think there's a picture of one on the slide for you. But people did not like the zoot suits, nor the people who wore them. And in June of 1943, there was a 4-day riot in Los Angeles with white sailors coming into their communities and attacking the zoot suiters. So while city police did little to restrain the sailors would tear off and burn their zoot suits and destroy property and cut their hair and beat them up. But when the Mexican Americans tried to fight back, the police moved in and arrested them. And in the aftermath of these riots, Los Angeles passed a law prohibiting the wearing of zoot suits. Still, all in all, there were employment and citizen gains for Mexican Americans during World War II. Now, during World War II, another group of people that I want to talk about are Native Americans. We really needed an unbreakable code that could help us communicate to protect our operational plans from the Japanese or the Germans. And the United States Marines knew where to find someone to do that. The Navajo Nation Marine Corps leadership selected 29 Navajo men called the Navajo Code Talkers who created a code based on their complex and unwritten Navajo language. Now, this code primarily used word association by assigning a Navajo word to key phrases in military tactics. This system enabled the code talkers to translate 3 lines of English in 20 seconds, not the 30 minutes, which was common with existing code-breaking machines. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute. The Code Talkers participated in every major Marine operation in the Pacific Theater, giving the Marines a critical advantage throughout the war. During the nearly month-long battle for Iwo Jima, for example, the 6 Navajo Code Talkers successfully transmitted more than 800 messages without error. Marine leadership noted that after the battle, that the Code Talkers were critical to the victory at Iwo Jima. And at the end of the war, the Navajo Code Talkers did not receive any special awards or recognition, even though their code virtually remained unbroken. They will receive recognition class in 2001. If there can be a good side to this war, it was in the science and technologies and new products that came out of it. And again, we don't have time to talk about it here, but the American government put a lot of money into research and development. Germany started the science and technology war, but the Allies will also benefit. The National Defense Research Committee was developed to support our advancements. For example, advances in radar and sonar worked with products already in place, like planes and ships, to aid in locating and corresponding with one another. Anti-aircraft technologies were more accurate and helped by the new technology. While Germany made substantial improvements in rocket technology, they were never able to create enough rockets to do the damage they really wanted. Interestingly, after the war, we brought the rocket team from Germany to Huntsville, Alabama class. There they helped build rockets to send man to the moon. Meanwhile, British and American forces developed new engine bombers in great numbers, allowing them to fly higher and longer than all of their German equivalents. And the big area of technological advancement came in gathering intelligence. Britain had a top-secret project called Ultra. Cryptologists worked to figure out the codes of the enemy, and much of Germany's coded communication made use of their so-called Enigma machine, which was effective because it constantly changed their coding systems. Polish mathematicians had worked out how to read the Enigma messages, but Germans changed that system daily. So people in Ulta were constantly working around the clock to find a way of breaking codes. Specifically, Alan Turing used his machine, the bomb, to decode German messages until the end of the war. And there's a movie out about that if you want to watch it. People were also working on computers to decode and process information at a rate never seen before. We really had dramatic success with the magic operation, like the British Ultra, and we were able to break the Japanese coding system and intercepted information that altered the Japanese plans. One other area I want to mention is in medicine, and penicillin began to be mass-produced, and it was used to treat widespread sexually transmitted disease that plagued our troops. But it also saved lives on the battlefield as well. I pulled in a link in the chapter module class so that you can read more about wartime science and technology advancements during World War II that help us to this day. Since the involvement in World War I, and really before, Americans had developed a prejudice about certain groups of foreigners, even if they were technically American citizens. So it was with World War II. First off, Italians were being persecuted. They were told not to leave the United States, and several hundred were imprisoned. But overall, people in the United States didn't really blame Italian Americans or German Americans for World War II, but they blamed the governments of those countries. but the greatest intolerance is going to be focused on Japanese Americans, class. According to your textbook, there were only about 127,000 Japanese Americans in the U.S., and most of those lived in a few areas of California. But in the atmosphere of World War II hysteria, Japanese Americans will be rounded up and placed in relocation centers, which is really what? It's really concentration camps. According to one U.S. general, he had no confidence in Japanese American loyalty whatsoever and continued to say, a Jap is a Jap. It makes no difference whether he's an American citizen or not. Class, some of these Japanese had never even been to Japan and they only spoke English. But nonetheless, President Roosevelt in 1942 authorized the Army to inter the Japanese Americans and created the War Relocation Authority to oversee this by issuing Executive Order 9066. More than 100,000 people, Japanese Americans, were gathered. They were told to dispose of their property. They often had to just abandon or forfeit their businesses, their money, their land, and they were taken to these camps. They were operated similar to prisons, while clearly not as brutal as the concentration camps that Hitler put in place for Jews. They were uncomfortable, oppressive, and Japanese Americans lost their livelihoods during this time. Some officials wanted the interred to serve as forced laborers, but the United States government did draw the line there and said no, but they could be hired out if they chose to do so. But between 1943 and 44, some Japanese Americans were actually allowed to leave the camps to attend colleges, mostly back east. Some were allowed to move and take jobs, but they had to have a sponsor. But remember, I want you to remember, most of them did not have a house or property to go back to at the end of the war. And think about this, class, even during the encampment period, many young men were drafted into the military to fight for the United States military. So that's somewhat ironic, I think. In 1944, the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus the U.S. ruled that the relocation was constitutionally permissible. When they finally were released in 1945, like I said, many had no homes or businesses to go back to, and there was still a widespread harassment. But I will note, in 1998, President Clinton issued an official apology, and the federal government gave payments of $5,000 to each of the 2,200 people who were still living that were of Japanese ancestry and that had been taken from their homes and imprisoned during World War II. African Americans were really eager to serve in the military, and they really believed that fighting would equate to better positions in society here in America after the war. Of course, that didn't happen, and the military did remain segregated for a while. The CORE, or Congress of Racial Equality, was organized in 1943 and included many of those African Americans who were serving during World War II. And they were attempting to mobilize mass popular resistance to discrimination in a way that the older, more conservative organizations had never done. And in 1944, CORE won a much publicized victory by forcing a Washington, D.C. restaurant to agree to serve African Americans. This CORE group helped the foot soldiers during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, and we'll talk more about them in a little bit later. The military typically used African Americans for menial duties and continued the tradition of Jim Crow laws and segregation. This included barring them from the Marine Corps or the American Air Forces, but public sentiment and groups like CORE began to change the minds of the military. And by the end of the war, the number of black servicemen had increased to 700,000, with some training camps actually becoming integrated. Many brave African Americans fought during World War II. For example, the Tuskegee Airmen from Alabama were the first African American military aviators in the United States Armed Air Forces. During World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen were subjected to discrimination both within and outside the Army, no matter their incredible exploits, and I hope you get a chance to read more about them. But nonetheless, Roosevelt will issue Executive Order 8802, which said, "There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries and in government because of race, creed, color, or national origin." It was the first presidential directive class on race since Reconstruction. The order established the Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate incidences of discrimination. So really, all in all, World War II will be the birth of the modern civil rights movement we'll talk about a little later. So back to the war for a minute, and let's see how it all comes to an end. The Allies were on the offensive now, which is a good place to be. American and British bombers attacked German industrial areas around the clock, and strategic bombing and breaking the Enigma code helped the Allies in their sea and air superiority. And on land, there will be D-Day. This is an enormous invasion force that gathered in England, also referred to as the Normandy landings, codename Operation Neptune. D-Day was on June 6, 1944 class, and the Allies sent a vast armada into action, landing in the French area of Normandy to liberate France once and for all from Germany. Fighting was intense along the beach, but within a week, German forces had been dislodged from the Normandy coast, and the Allies continued on the mainland until they reached the Rhine River. The weather was against them, and in mid-December, German forces struck back at what is now called the Battle of the Bulge, named for this large bulge that appeared in the American lines as the Germans pressed forward. Eventually, the Germans were brought down on both sides. The Soviets were kicking their booties on one side, the Americans and British were on the other. And on April the 30th, 1945, Hitler killed himself in his bunker in Berlin along with some of his closest followers. On May 8th, the remaining German forces surrendered unconditionally, and VE Day, or Victory in Europe, will be celebrated worldwide. Class, again, I've pulled in more about D-Day and the incredible heroics that day in your chapter module in Canvas if you want to know more. In the Pacific, the United States Navy continued destroying Japanese stations. Without ships to get goods, their economy began to be crippled. Believe it or not, for the U.S. to get supplies to China, some troops actually had to cross the Himalayas through India. They also had some airlifts. The Americans continued their attacks in the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, the Carolines, the Philippines, and then came the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the largest naval engagement in history. The Americans held off the Japanese, and the Marines seized the tiny volcanic island of Iwo Jima. As you may know, it was one of the costliest single battles in the history of the Marine Corps. The Marines suffered over 25,000 casualties, and the Japanese even more. When the Empire of Japan would not surrender, we relentlessly firebombed Tokyo, killing over 100,000 citizens. Not soldiers, but citizens. Still, they would not surrender. During the Battle of Okinawa, where Japanese resistance included kamikaze suicide bomber planes against the American and British ships, many lives were lost, and it was waged over about 3 months. But more about the Battle of Okinawa when you watch the required conscientious objector film in the class. We shall see one thing that will happen in April of 1945 that will greatly alter our world, and that's going to be the death of Roosevelt and Harry Truman coming in as president. A secret project was going on, class, that not even Truman knew about until he took office. The plan to make atomic weapons was called the Manhattan Project, and the United States spent 3 years and $2 billion to create this incredible weapon. There were several hidden laboratories in America that were conducting the experimenting and building of these weapons. Some of them were in Tennessee, New Mexico, Washington, and there were other sites. But they were finally able to test the first one in New Mexico on July the 16th, 1945, and the creators called their bomb the Trinity, and it had a blinding flash of light, possibly the brightest ever before on Earth, followed by a mushroom cloud in a barren desert. Now that Truman was president, he learned about this weapon, and he sent an ultimatum to the Japanese demanding that they surrender. They said they would consider surrender with conditions, but the United States said no, no conditions, unconditional surrender. Truman ordered the Air Force to use the new atomic weapon against the Japanese. And while historians and politicians disagree, what do you think? Was the dropping of the bomb necessary or not? According to my father, during World War II, soldiers felt like it was either them or us. So during the final stages of World War II, the United States dropped an atomic bomb first on Hiroshima on August the 6th of 1945, but still no surrender. Nagasaki will be next, class, on August 9th, 1945, and these two bombings killed nearly 225,000 people, most of whom were civilians, almost instantly, and remain to this day the only use of nuclear weapons in the history of armed conflict, and let's hope it stays that way. On August the 15th, 6 days after bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the subsequent Soviet Union declared war against Japan, the Empire of Japan announced its unconditional surrender to the Allies. And on September 2nd, in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese government signed their surrender, which effectively ended World War II. The effects of the bombings on the effect of social and political culture in world history has really been studied extensively, and the ethical and legal justification for bombings are still being debated to this day. Class, World War II proves to be the deadliest international conflict in history, taking the lives of up to 80 million people, including the 6 million Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis. Civilians made up an estimated 50 million deaths from war, while the military comprised 21 to 25 million of those lost. Millions more will be injured, and still more are going to lose their homes and their property. But the legacy of the war will include the spread of communism from the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, as well as its eventual triumph in China, and a global shift in power from Europe to two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They'll soon face off against each other in the Cold War. Next up, class, we will take a look at the Cold War that dominates world history for nearly 50 years. As usual, keep in touch.